Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I just love this banner because it really, to me, sums up the anti-badger cull campaign. I've seen this at many of the rallies, the 39 rallies that we've had in marches in towns and cities across this country. What I really want to talk to you about is why this book to me is important, and why this issue of protecting badgers is more than just about this species. It's really about the future of our countryside and the future of the wildlife, and about what we do as individuals to stand up for something that is so wrong. You know, I came into the debate about wildlife conservation from working in government and working in industry. I'd been a civil servant in the Ministry of Agriculture for many years. I'd worked in the food industry and the plant science industry. I was close to farming organisations and senior figures in the food chain. I didn't come into the debate about badgers from a sort of green environmental background. But in many ways, I suppose I came in from the right place, because I understood what was happening in the farming industry and the food industry, and I understood how this animal was being demonised and being used as a scapegoat and blamed for modern farming practices which were damaging both in terms of the environment, animal health, and the protection of our wildlife. Now, the badger's a fascinating animal. It's a nocturnal animal. Most of us never see a badger alive. We see them dead by the side of the road. We don't know an awful lot about their behaviour, an awful lot about their ecology. They are a very elusive animal, but they are one of our largest surviving mammals, now that we've lost our wolves and our bears from our countryside here in the United Kingdom. They've lived in our isles for about 500,000 years. They are an incredibly powerful, strong, resilient animal, but an animal that we've had a love-hate relationship with that goes back many hundreds of years. They weren't an animal that had any protection in terms of royal protection the way that deer and other species did to be hunted. So basically, badgers were largely left to poor people in rural communities to do what they wanted with them. And what we found in Britain, if you go back in the 16th, 17th centuries, was a tradition of digging these animals out, and they were used in the inns to fight with dogs, which was horrible and barbaric, but that happened up and down the country. This situation got much worse when we had the Industrial Revolution from the 17th century, 18th century onwards. And particularly when we went into the sort of 19th century and the huge industrialization of our colliery and mining industry in Britain, we suddenly found a new generation of people who would actually, for their leisure time, persecute the badger. So colliery workers up and down the country used to go out at the weekend and dig out badger sets and put dogs down these sets. Now, as we went into the 20th century, the level of destruction of badger sets and the level of persecution of these animals started to really worry the broader public. And what we found is the first badger protection groups were established in places like Wales, in Wirral and Cheshire in the late 60s and early 70s. And people were effectively sitting on badger sets, protecting them against the diggers. And that's when the first pressure started to be created in Parliament to give this animal special protection. In 1973, thankfully, the Badger Protection Act became law as a private member's bill that came about because of those first original badger protection groups forcing the issue and getting good MPs who cared about wildlife to take it up in Parliament. The tragedy for the badger is that when it got protection in 1973, it fell into this big controversy about the future of our farming industry. Because that very same year, Ministry of Agriculture vets found a number of badgers that had TB. And they started to make a connection between TB and badgers and TB in cattle, bovine TB, which is a disease, which is a zoonotic disease that can cross into the human population and would lead to animals being destroyed in terms of the herd and restrictions on the movement and sale of cattle, which has a significant social and economic impact on dairy farmers and livestock farmers. And that's really where the debate about the badger and the protection of the badger in the modern age starts, and that's really where my story starts in terms of campaigning to protect this animal. Now, Badger to Death really tells a story about politics. It tells a story about power, greed, and money. It tells a story about incompetence, negligence, and deceit that goes back 40 years. When I wrote this book, there were a number of things I really wanted to answer. Firstly, is it right to blame the badger for spreading bovine TB to cattle? Well, the first thing I would say is that we know one thing very, very clearly from all the mountains of research and scientific evidence that we've seen over the last 40 years, is that badgers have got TB from cattle. They've got it as a form of industrial pollution that's spilled into our wildlife, not just into badgers, but into rats, deer, and other species, domestic animals like cats as well. As we've intensified our livestock industry, as we've moved millions of cattle around the country through markets with poor biosecurity, as we've kept cattle inside for longer periods of time breathing over each other, they've spread TB. And then we've also taken catastrophic decisions that have allowed the disease to explode. The worst of those, which I talk about in some depth in this book, was at the time of the foot and mouth crisis in 2001, which many of you will remember. The worst incident of foot and mouth since we had in 1968, spread rapidly across the country, and caught the government of Tony Blair at the time by surprise and caused panic across the food chain. It resulted in the countryside being shut off for many months. It resulted in the delay of a general election that year. It resulted in the destruction of millions of cows and sheep, and over £6 billion having to be paid to farmers in compensation of rural businesses. But the worst aspect of that policy is that the National Farmers Union, after the destruction of the herd, forced the government to restock cattle from areas of the country where there were TB hotspots, where we knew there were real problems with the disease, particularly in the southwest. There wasn't much in the way of foot and mouth in that area, but there was TB problems. They forced the government's hands to move cattle without any proper TB testing for almost 2 years. So what happened is a disease in 2001 that infected about 5,000 cattle, a tiny percentage of the herd, which was not a massive, massive problem in relation to the whole herd that we have in this country, suddenly became much bigger because we moved hundreds of thousands of cows, no proper testing, no control. So within 18 months, we'd gone from having 5,000 cows with TB to over 28,000. It was industrial pollution on a scale that's never been seen before, and it was a disastrous decision by the then Labour Agriculture Minister Nick Brown under Tony Blair. And this is where it all became very political, because no one in MAF, as it was then, wants to admit they made a mistake. The National Farmers Union doesn't want to own up to what they did at the time in terms of forcing the hand of the government. The chief vet made it very clear to the Agriculture Minister and Tony Blair at the time that actually this was a catastrophic move. He said, I want to see all the markets that we move cattle through reviewed in terms of biosecurity. I'd like to see many of them shut down because they're not fit for purpose. And I'd like to see rigorous testing and movement controls before any cattle start moving across the country. His concerns were dismissed, and the problems arose as a result. But then you needed to blame someone for those catastrophic decisions. And this is where the Badgered blame game, as I call it, went into overdrive. This is where government ministers, policymakers, the National Farmers Union, all started to move the focus away from catastrophic cattle measures to blaming the badger. So as the disease in the cattle increased, they said it's all down to the badger. And the clamour to kill this animal grew and grew and grew. Now, the Labour Party at the time in government under Tony Blair had tried to defer a badger culling policy by undertaking what was called the Randomized badger culling trial, the biggest peer-reviewed piece of research ever undertaken to get the answer as to whether killing badgers would actually reduce the level of TB in cattle. They killed 11,000 badgers, took 8 years, spent over £50 million to come up with a piece of research that said, if you do cull badgers, it's going to make no meaningful contribution to lowering this disease at all, and in fact, it could make the situation worse as a result of what's called perturbation, where you could risk increasing the level of stress on the animals and move them from one area to another, which could result in an increasing spread in the disease. And most importantly, they said, the one way that we know you can reduce it, and has been proven across Europe and other parts of the world, is you actually clamp down on movement controls, you improve the TB testing levels, and if necessary, if it's persistent in the herd, you destroy the whole herd when you have outbreaks of TB and you stop farming for an extensive period of time. That will reduce this disease quickly and rapidly and effectively without having to kill any wildlife at all. Now, in most situations, that would be the end of the result. You know, you would have a situation, £50 million public money spent, both parties would agree, okay, no good killing badgers, let's move on. But it became political. And I talk at length in this book about David Cameron, when he was an opposition leader of the Conservative Party making decisions about the value of culling badgers and seeking to return fox hunting as a so-called sport in this country, to win votes in rural communities, to court the Countryside Alliance, a powerful movement of which has significant influence over the Conservative Party and the National Farmers Union, the farming lobby as well. He played politics with this issue. To win votes in 2010, he was willing to kill badgers. And actually, the whole strategy he played was actually quite successful. He didn't win a majority, as we know, he had to go into coalition with the Liberals, but he got enough seats in rural constituencies as a result of playing the badger blame game to help him get close to the finishing line. And he was fortunate that he had a coalition partner, the Liberal Democrats, who had lots of MPs in the southwest that also wanted to kill badgers because they were coming under pressure from dairy farmers in that part of the world. So in 2010, I think on page 38 of the coalition agreement, there are 3 lines to say that the coalition government would move forward with a badger culling policy based on science to reduce the spread of bovine TB in cattle. Now then, we talk about science. There is no science for badger culling to a large degree. It's a political decision. What we have done over the last 4 years is killed just under 4,000 badgers and spent the best part of £25 million of taxpayers' money. We've tested none of them for TB. We know from the randomised badger culling trial that probably only about 1.65% of those animals have TB, in the sense that they are actively putting that disease out. They're called super excretors, where they're excreting it through their skin, excreting it through their feces, possibly, and also through their urine, and possibly spreading it to other badgers and increasing the risk of the spread of the disease. The vast majority of those animals, of the 11,000 killed in the randomized badger culling trial, did not fall into that category. And the reason the government have not tested any of the ones they've killed is because they know they'll get the same answer. So we've been basically blindly culling badgers and also doing it on the cheap for a very cruel culling method. The randomized badger culling trial used civil servants who they digged in cages, trapped the badger and killed it in the morning. Now, I don't agree with any of that. Most of you in this room wouldn't. But I would say if you kill a badger at point blank range in a cage, you're killing it quickly. What this government came forward with was a cheaper policy, that you would basically take pest controllers with a day of training. They would be allowed to bait outside badger sets, so the badgers come up at night, and they would shoot them with silencers and rifles. Now, anyone who's shot animals for a living would tell you that's going to be difficult. These animals are low squat, muscular, very shy, and very difficult to kill. And what happened is the independent expert panel that the government set up for the first year of that policy found that this was a very, very cruel method of killing. Many of these animals took 10 or 15 minutes to die of blood loss and multiple organ failure, and a horrible, horrible way to die. And they said to the government, you can't continue with this. But they keep doing it because it's cheap. And if you had to go to a cage trap policy only, they couldn't afford it. So we're not only killing animals blindly without testing them, we're killing them cruelly. And the worst aspect of it is we've got no scientific evidence to prove it's working at all. In fact, if you look at the culling zones of Gloucestershire, Somerset and Dorset, we're actually seeing an increase in those areas in new TB outbreaks in cattle and in long-term incidents of cattle outbreaks for TB as well. In Wales, though, we've tried an alternative approach. The Welsh government, after a legal challenge from the Badger Trust, chose not to go forward with badger culling after 2012, to put forward much more rigorous testing methods across the whole of Wales. That means they test cattle every year for TB, whereas in Britain, in many cases, we don't test them 4 years or more in terms of gaps between testing. They have more rigorous controls in terms of movement. They have more rigorous compensation systems tied to the farmers having to put in place proper controls. And what they have done is they've reduced new incidents of TB in their cattle over the last 5 years by 48%. And most importantly, that long-term new herd incident figure has fallen by 14% in the last 12 months alone. Now, they have done a small amount of badger vaccination. Now, badger vaccination is useful in my view because it could help reduce the spread of the disease in badgers that don't have it, and also reduce the spread of the disease in newborn cubs. It will not basically take TB away from an animal that has the disease. And as we don't really believe that badgers spread TB to cattle, I'm not convinced that vaccination is an answer in terms of reducing the problem for farmers. But if it helps, in my view, to build bridges with farmers, between conservation groups, farmers and landowners, it's worth pursuing. And in Wales, they have done this in a small area. The most interesting thing about the Welsh government decision, though, is that when they took all those badgers, and they've vaccinated over 4,000 of them, they visually inspected the animals to see if any of them had visible TB lesions. That would put them in that super excreta category. And they've not found any of them. They've basically let them all go because they've not found any that have got that late-stage TB. Now, all of that matters, that story I've just told you, because that shows you scientifically this is not working. It shows you that it's cruel, and actually it's a huge waste of money. And what this book really does is tell a story about how everyone who should have reached the conclusion that this should have stopped has failed miserably. The government have failed. And that includes the liberal element of the coalition up to 2015. The last Labour government, in my view, failed because they took catastrophic decisions that led to that explosion in the disease. I talk in this book about the failure of the media as well, because when you look at broadcasters like the BBC, at times, they have played the badger blame game as well. Many of you might remember, and I talk about it in the book, the Princess Anne interview on Countryfile, where basically she talked about badgers going to sleep nicely, they're being gassed. Let me tell you, there's nothing nice about gassing badgers. Between 1975 and 1982, we gassed thousands of them using cyanide gas. When you pump that gas into badger sets, they have many entry and exit points. It does not move uniformly through the set. So most of the animals don't get enough of the dose of the gas to kill them outright. Many of them die long, agonizing deaths. Some of them just suffer brain damage and move between sets. The only reason we knew the answer to that is because after 7 years of killing these animals in this disgusting way, it was the Porton Down Weapons Laboratory that came back to the Conservative government of the day and said, this is horrible, we've researched this in our weapons laboratory, these animals scream with agony, they die in the most disgusting situation, and this is not going to be acceptable to the public. So Peter Walker, the Agriculture Minister, had to go back in the House of Commons in 1982 and say, we've got to stop it. But there are farmers today that still believe that we should be gassing these animals. And the other problem we have is they are being gassed. They are being shot. They are being snared, as I talked about earlier. This animal, despite protection, is being killed in large numbers up and down the country. And to a degree, I talk about it here, is that the government and the farming lobby have turned a blind eye to this legal persecution. In fact, they're almost happy, I would say, in certain quarters that it goes on because it helps to reduce the number of these animals. There are many senior civil servants who have gone on record, and politicians, to say actually giving the animal protection was a significant mistake. No, it wasn't. It was given protection to stop it being killed in horrible, horrible ways across this country, and that still continues, and the protection is needed more today than ever before. So the BBC have failed when they've had interviews like Princess Anne on Country File, because what they did was allow her to speak without being questioned properly about what she considered to be a humane way of killing, when we know the science was actually completely opposite, would tell us it was completely inhumane and should never happen. And then we have series like Hope and Glory that some of you might have seen recently that followed Country Life magazine for a year. The first episode looked at a farmer called Maurice Durbin in Somerset who had TB in his herd. But it was a completely one-sided programme. It looked at a farmer with significant economic problems because of TB. But it zoomed. We haven't won this argument yet, but I hope in a small way this book will bring that story to people's attention. It's my story, of course, but it's equally the story about people standing up for what's right. And I say that it might not be you're interested in badgers. It might be that you want to protect your local fire station or hospital or stop fracking on a field down the road. But actually, this story is about standing up and being counted, and about saying, I'm not going to let a government or an industry that is powerful decide the future of what's going on around me. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to say enough is enough. So that's what Badgered to Death is about. I hope those who read it will enjoy it. I've been really pleased with the reaction. I must say thank you to Chris Packham, because his forward on this book is wonderful. I know he's taken some flack in recent days from certain hunting interests and MPs who are saying this is another reason why he should be removed from the BBC. No, it's another reason why he should be treasured by the BBC. It's another reason why we should all treasure him, because wildlife conservation isn't just armchair entertainment. It's about standing up for what's right. And he, alongside people like Brian May, alongside people like Bill Oddie, alongside people like Patrick Barkham, and many other people are not so well known that I mentioned in this book, are part of that badger army, part of that wildlife conservation voice in this country that are making everyone stand up and think. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy this book. I hope you will read it and share it. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Hello, my friend. How are you?
Craig and Becky.
So Craig.
I'm Becky. B-E-C-K-Y.
B-E-C-K-Y, yeah? Thank you. Thanks for coming.
No, I just got